Good day, and welcome in our next discussion in my series about why Christianity needs to awake or die. And it's actually happening. Both. Some are awake and some just die. The question we look at this morning is, where does Yahweh come from? Yahweh is the Old Testament God and is still the God of the Israeli people or the Jewish faith. And it is interesting that this God portrays itself as being the creator of everything, the whole universe. And this is what the Jewish people or the Jewish faith believes. Now, the Christianity also believes in the Old Testament and therefore also believes in Yahweh. But is Yahweh the God that we actually should believe in? And if not, where does he come from? And how did it happen that Yahweh became such an influential God within the Middle East and then later on across the world? The first evidence that we can find in literature about Yahweh dates from the 13th century before Christ, in the time of Ramses II, the Pharaoh in Egypt. And it's actually in the writings of the Egyptians that we read about Yahweh, when they said they won a war over the nomads in the northwestern Arabian Peninsula, west of the Jordan River. And these nomads had a god called Yahweh. Now, these people were nomadic people, mostly shepherds, moving around in this area west of the Jordan River, which is also part of the then Canaan area. There was a second group that prayed to the god El, which lived west of the Jordan River, and El was part of the Elohim, which was a word that was used to talk about the gods. Elohim in the Old Testament, we find it several times in the Old Testament, and sadly it is translated in the Old Testament as God. You find it in Genesis 1 when it says the Elohim created everything that existed, and Genesis 1 says in the translations God created, which is a wrong translation from the Hebrew language. Now, El was followed by the sea people who lived next to or close to the Mediterranean within the Middle Eastern area of today's Israel. And these sea people, and you may guess who they were in Bible times, the Philistines. And they believed in El. El is the singular form of the word Elohim, which is the plural form of El. The first time that we actually read about the Sashu people, who are this nomadic tribe that moved around with Yahweh, is then in Ramses II, but something happened that made them become a more bigger group or a more bigger religion within that area. And that came about during the 12th and 11th century before Christ, when it is the end of the Bronze Age. The Egyptian Empire at that stage became a smaller empire, and they lost grip on the Middle Eastern area where the Sashu people and the Philistines lived, and it left a vacuum of power open in that area. And that's when the Sashu people moved in and kind of became very powerful in that area. And it is from the 9th century before Christ that we really start reading about the Yahwistic tradition in that area being the most popular belief system or religion. So when the Egyptians kind of pulled out of the Middle Eastern area at the end of the previous Bronze Age, these Sashu people, which we kind of can believe was the Israeli people, moved in and conquered that area. Now they moved in with Yahweh. That was their God. But at that stage, it was a Yahwistic cult, a very centralized religion around the Sashu people and nothing outside of that. You don't read about Yahweh in, for instance, what we talked about last week, the Assurbanipal library did not contain any information about Yahweh. He was part of the pantheon of gods in the Middle East, in the Canaan lands, and with him then El. And it is these two names, Yahweh and El, that we find in the Old Testament scriptures. So what happened is that the Sashu people became more and more influential, and Yahweh, which was a storm god, it was a warrior god. Yahweh was associated with thunderstorms and flash floods, which you get in that area, and he was the god of that. And he was also this warrior god that sent his people out, these Sashu people, to go and conquer, to raid, to take what they need and then pull back. As being a nomadic tribe, they moved around and couldn't really be located in one place. El, on the other side, was a really fatherly god, very kind of lovingly and gracefully, and he belonged to the Philistine or the sea peoples. And then as these two groups of people assimilate within the area of Israel after the end of the previous Bronze Age and became the more powerful group in that area, these two gods were assimilated. Now we read about El in Psalm 82. And Psalm 82, if you read it in the Hebrew scriptures, you can really read what El is about, because it says El stands in the congregation or in the grouping of the Elohim. So what happened that Elohim was translated in the Old Testament as just being a singular God is because in later years the Judaistic tradition or the Jewish faith started to become a monotheistic religion, and therefore all the evidence of a pantheon of gods must have been removed, and that's why the translations then became singular. Originally, the Yahweh tradition or the Jewish faith or the Judaistic tradition was a henotheistic religion. Henotheism means there's a pantheon of gods. All these gods are recognized, but there's only one God that is kind of hailed as the most important God, in this case then Yahweh. Before 586, now what happened in 586 before Christ? At 586 before Christ, the Babylonians came and they took over the area and they took the Israelites away in exile. You can read it in the Old Testament. Before that, Israel was a tribal nation, and they had a Yahwistic tribal god, and it was kind of a cult. But coming back, they were Judaism, organized in a monotheistic religion, and organized around the sole God of Yahweh. So a lot happened in exile when this group of people were in Babylon, in today's Iraq, where they came into contact with monotheistic religions, and they kind of changed their whole religion into becoming a monotheistic tradition. And then the writing of the scriptures took place when most of the Old Testament scriptures has been written down or rewritten in that time, and the name Yahweh was superimposed onto older traditions and older histories. And in many cases, it kind of replaced the word El or the word Elohim. In Psalm 82, it was never done. And therefore, that is the oldest tradition, Canaanite tradition in the Old Testament that we have, and that we can really read about El, the other God. These two gods, El, the elderly, fatherly, lovingly, gracefully God, and Yahweh, the storm God, the one that killed children, the one that sent his people out to become this warrior nation, the one that called his people as his chosen people, and only they belong to him, that we know are everything that we read in the Old Testament. This Yahweh and this El God were assimilated. They became one God in the Old Testament. And therefore, that's the reason why in one case we read about Yahweh being this warrior, and then we read Yahweh becoming suddenly very lovingly and very gracefully, and forgiveness is in the forefront. It's because it's these two different gods that got married within the tradition of the Judaism. And after 586, when they returned to Israel, rebuilt the temple in Jerusalem, then it was this Judaistic faith with this monotheistic God, which used two names, El and Yahweh, being portrayed as the only God in the world and as being the creator. The creation story that we have in the Old Testament, as well as the story of Noah, they came into contact when they were in exile in Babylonia, and they adopted those stories, rewrote them with Yahweh as the main God, or the Elohim El as the main God in these stories, and being portrayed as one God, so that it is this monotheistic tradition with this monotheistic story. There can be said much about Yahweh. We touched on that in the previous video. So what I'm trying today is to explain to you where Yahweh is coming from, and I'm going to end with a question which I want to ask now, just to get your brain running and to get the awakening process going. Was Jesus then the Son of Yahweh? If he is the only begotten Son of God, was Jesus then the Son of Yahweh? And that will be the next video after this one, where I will look into that. What can we say about that? But what is important for today is to understand that Yahweh was one of a pantheon of gods, as El was one of the pantheon of gods in Canaan, in that area, in that land. And then it became about that Yahweh became the important God of the Shashu people, which was the nomads. El became the important God of the sea people, and these two people met after the Bronze Age and then became kind of one group within one religion, and then Yahweh took over as being the most important God, and also being called in the Old Testament El and Elohim. And there is evidence for that, for all of this. It's not just believe it because that is what we think happened. There are evidence within the Mesopotamian tradition, and especially in the Canaan tradition and literature, as I mentioned before, even in Egypt. Now, all of this make only sense if we look at the following. The oldest scriptures that we have in the Old Testament is Exodus 15 verses 1 to 18, Judges 5, Psalm 18, 29, 68 and 82, and Genesis 49. These are the oldest bits in the Old Testament that we have within the Jewish tradition. And in all these parts we can read about the Elohim, that is the most prominent, the gods. The henotheism that I was talking about is very clear in these passages. It's a very complex and a very long history to marry these different gods within Canaan to bring about the Jewish faith. And it's not only El and Yahweh who were the most important gods. A god like Baal also played a very influential influence within the creation of the Jewish faith and the creation of the Jewish God. We read in the history of Omri, for instance, one of the kings of Israel, that there was always this competition between Yahweh and Baal, and the El is also featuring there. And then some of these kings would clear the temple and clear out all the evidence of Baal, and then the next king will bring it back again, and some will stay, some symbols and traditions will stay behind. So for years and years and years, this happened in the Middle East. It was not like people moving in with a total new faith, the Jewish faith, and this was a perfect faith that was there forever. No, it is a development over a complex development of marrying different gods from the Canaan pantheon to eventually, after 586, come to the point where they kind of have one God that represented all these gods and then presented that as the ultimate God, who is the only true God in the world. This is an awakening process to start to understand that Yahweh is a cultural God, is a tribal God, and is not this God that created and made Adam and Eve and, wiped them out during the flood and then saved Noah and then creates a new civilization with the sons of Noah. This is not Yahweh's work. So welcome on this journey, and I hope this does not confuse you, but really makes you or gives you an interest in where our traditions come from and how do we look at them in a modern time like today, when we have all these other evidence that we now have about the Bible, and we have to wake up and awake to understand what Christianity is. And that is the goal of this series, to look at the real God of Christianity that Jesus introduced, who that God is, and it is mind-blowing and really interesting. So stay tuned.